Welcome to Criminal Nights. Tonight, I'll take you into the shadows of true crime, where power corrupts absolutely, and those who govern us sometimes become the very monsters they swore to protect us from. Before we dive into these dark corridors of political corruption and murder, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching Criminal Nights from. The rain hammered against my windshield as I drove through the outskirts of Chicago that October night. In 2008, I was investigating what would become one of the most shocking political scandals in American history, a tale of corruption so deep, so pervasive, that it would shake the very foundations of Illinois politics. The man at the center of it all, Governor Rod Blagojevich, a charismatic politician whose hunger for power would ultimately consume him. I remember the first time I saw Blagojevich speak at a campaign rally in 2002. His voice carried across the crowd with an almost evangelical fervor, promising transparency, promising change. His thick, perfectly styled hair caught the stage lights as he gestured dramatically, his Chicago accent rolling through promises of reform. What none of us knew then was that behind those confident eyes lurked a man capable of selling the highest office in the land to the highest bidder. The story truly begins on November 4th, 2008. Barack Obama had just been elected President of the United States, leaving behind his Senate seat, a seat that only Governor Blagojevich had the constitutional power to fill. What should have been a moment of civic duty became something far more sinister. In the governor's mansion that night, as America celebrated its new president, Blagojevich was already plotting how to monetize this opportunity. I can still hear the crackling of those FBI wiretap recordings when they were first played in court. Blagojevich's voice, distorted through federal surveillance equipment, carried a casual brutality that chilled everyone in that courtroom. "I've got this thing, and it's fucking golden," he said, referring to Obama's Senate seat. "I'm just not giving it up for fucking nothing." The way he drawled those words, the sheer audacity of treating a Senate seat like a commodity at auction, it revealed something fundamentally broken in his moral compass. But the corruption ran deeper than anyone initially imagined. As I dug through FBI files and court documents, patterns emerged that painted a picture of systematic abuse of power spanning years. Blagojevich hadn't just stumbled into corruption. He had built an entire political machine around it. Take the Children's Memorial Hospital case. In 2008, the hospital's CEO contacted Blagojevich's administration, seeking an increase in Medicaid reimbursement rates, money that would directly help sick children receive better care. But in Blagojevich's world, nothing came without a price. Through intermediaries, the governor made it clear the hospital could have its funding increase, but only if the CEO's wife made a substantial campaign contribution to Blagojevich's political fund. I interviewed one of the hospital administrators involved in those negotiations. She spoke to me on condition of anonymity, her voice barely above a whisper, as we sat in a dimly lit coffee shop on Chicago's North Side. "We knew it was wrong," she told me, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred her coffee. "But we kept thinking about the children. How do you weigh campaign finance violations against a child's life?" The weight of that moral compromise hung heavy in the air between us. What made it even more disturbing was how casually these transactions occurred. Blagojevich treated state resources like his personal piggy bank, using his position to extort money from anyone who needed something. From the state government, road construction contracts, medical funding, regulatory approvals, everything had a price. And that price was always a contribution to Rod Blagojevich's political ambitions. The FBI had been watching for months. Special Agent Daniel Kane, who led the investigation, later described to me the meticulous process of building their case. "We knew we were dealing with someone who saw public service as a business opportunity," Kane told me during a tense interview at an FBI field office. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his weathered face as he recalled the investigation. but we needed ironclad evidence. You don't take down a sitting governor on suspicion. The wiretaps revealed conversations that would have been comical if they weren't so deeply troubling. Blagojevich discussing potential Senate appointees, like a fantasy football draft, assigning monetary values to different candidates based on what they could do for him politically or financially. He considered appointing himself to the Senate seat, believing it would position him for a future presidential run. The narcissism was breathtaking. On one recording, Blagojevich can be heard strategizing about how to leverage the Senate appointment for maximum personal gain. Unless I get something real good for the Senate seat, shit, I'll just send myself. You know what I'm saying. The casual profanity. The complete disregard for democratic principles. It painted a picture of a man who had lost all connection to the purpose of public service. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Blagojevich case wasn't the corruption itself, it was how normalized it had become within his inner circle. His wife Patty was captured on wiretaps, encouraging his schemes. His chief of staff, his advisors, his fundraisers, they had all become complicit in a system where selling government influence was just another day at the office. I spoke with former state employees who worked under Blagojevich, people who had entered government service with genuine intentions to help their communities. One former staffer, who I'll call Sarah, met me at a parking garage downtown, her paranoia about speaking publicly still evident years later. You could feel the poison spreading through the entire administration, she told me, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. Good people were leaving, and the ones who stayed either became part of the machine or learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. The unraveling began on December 9th, 2008. I was at home when the news broke. FBI agents had arrested Governor Blagojevich at his North Side home at 6:15 a.m. The images of him being led away in handcuffs, his famous hair disheveled for, perhaps, the first time in public, marked the beginning of the end for one of the most corrupt political figures in American history. What struck me most about that arrest was the timing. Federal agents had been listening to his phone calls for months, but they moved when they did because Blagojevich was accelerating his schemes. He was becoming desperate, more brazen, more reckless. The FBI feared he was about to actually sell that Senate seat, crossing a line from which there might be no legal return. The criminal complaint filed that day read like a thriller novel. 24 pages of detailed accusations, including conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud, solicitation of bribery, and conspiracy to commit extortion. But buried within those legal proceedings was a more disturbing truth. This wasn't just about one corrupt governor. It was about a system so broken that such behavior could flourish for years without consequence. As I researched deeper into Blagojevich's background, I discovered a pattern of ethical compromises that stretched back to his early political career. As a state representative, then congressman, he had consistently pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Campaign finance violations, questionable real estate deals, using his office to benefit family members. The signs had been there all along, ignored or explained away by a political establishment that valued loyalty over integrity. The trial itself became a spectacle. Blagojevich, ever the performer, treated the courthouse steps like a campaign stage. I watched him deliver impromptu speeches to gathered media, his confidence seemingly unshaken by the mountain of evidence against him. "I'm going to fight this thing every step of the way," he declared, his voice carrying that same evangelical tone I remembered from years earlier. "I'm going to fight until I take my last breath." But inside the courtroom, away from the cameras and the crowds, the reality was far different. Prosecutor Patrick Fitzgerald methodically dismantled Blagojevich's defense, playing recording after recording of the governor's own words. The jury sat in stunned silence as they heard a sitting governor casually discuss selling a Senate seat like it was a used car. One particularly damning recording captured Blagojevich's response when told that Obama's preferred candidate for the Senate seat came with no financial benefit to the governor. "Well, fuck him," Blagojevich said, his voice dripping with contempt. For nothing, fuck him." The casual vulgarity, the complete disregard for the democratic process. It revealed a man who had forgotten that he was a public servant, not a king. The psychological profile that emerged during the trial was deeply disturbing. Expert witnesses testified about Blagojevich's narcissistic tendencies, his inability to distinguish between public service and personal enrichment. Dr. Helen Morrison, a forensic psychiatrist, described to me her analysis of the governor's behavior. "What we saw was someone who genuinely believed the rules didn't apply to him," she explained as we sat in her downtown Chicago office, law books and case files stacked around us like fortifications. The power had corrupted him so completely that he couldn't even recognize his own criminality. As the evidence mounted, stories emerged from within the governor's administration that painted an even darker picture. State employees described a culture of fear and intimidation, where questioning the governor's decisions could mean the end of your career. Contracts were awarded based on political contributions rather than merit. Qualified candidates for state positions were passed over in favor of those willing to pay for access. If you're finding this descent into political corruption is chilling, as I did when I first uncovered these details, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another night of true crime darkness. The most disturbing aspect of the Blagojevich case wasn't just the blatant corruption. It was how it exposed the vulnerability of our entire democratic system. Here was a man elected by the people of Illinois, entrusted with enormous power, using that power to enrich himself at the expense of those he had sworn to serve. Every decision he made as governor was potentially tainted by personal financial considerations rather than the public good. I remember interviewing families who had been affected by Blagojevich's schemes. One woman, whose elderly mother needed specialized care that required state approval, broke down crying as she described the months of bureaucratic delays that coincidentally ended only after her family made a significant campaign contribution. "My mother suffered because this man saw her medical needs as a business opportunity," she told me, her grief transforming into rage. "He stole from sick people, from children, from anyone who needed help from their own government." The reach of Blagojevich's corruption extended into areas that touched the most vulnerable members of society. State contracts for social services, medical care for the poor, educational funding, all of it became part of his personal fundraising apparatus. Every dollar extracted through these schemes was a dollar taken from programs designed to help Illinois citizens who had nowhere else to turn. But perhaps the most chilling revelation came during the testimony of his former chief of staff, who described the governor's reaction when confronted with the ethical implications of his actions. Blagojevich reportedly laughed, dismissing concerns about corruption as the cost of doing business in politics. The complete absence of remorse, the inability to comprehend why selling government influence might be wrong. It suggested something fundamentally broken in his psychological makeup. As the trial progressed, I found myself obsessing over a single question. How had this happened? How had someone so clearly unsuited for public office managed to reach the highest level of state government? The answer, I discovered, lay in a system that rewarded charisma over character, campaign contributions over competence. Blagojevich had always been better at playing the game than governing. His rise through Illinois politics was marked by an ability to tell people what they wanted to hear, while simultaneously working behind the scenes to enrich himself and his allies. He understood that most voters paid attention to politics only during election seasons, giving him nearly unlimited freedom to operate however he chose once in office. The conspiracy extended beyond just the governor himself. His wife Patty was deeply involved in many of the schemes, using her position as the governor's spouse to facilitate corrupt deals. Campaign fundraisers acted as intermediaries, creating layers of plausible deniability, while ensuring that money flowed from those seeking state business to the governor's political accounts. During the trial, federal prosecutors revealed that Blagojevich had been caught on tape discussing the possibility of appointing Oprah Winfrey to Obama's Senate seat, not because she was qualified, but because such a high-profile appointment might boost his own national profile. The cynicism was staggering, using one of America's most beloved public figures as a prop in his own political theater. On June 27, 2011, after deliberating for 10 days, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty on 17 of 20 corruption charges, including the attempted sale of Obama's Senate seat. I was in the courtroom that day, watching as Blagojevich's face went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, and finally, a kind of hollow resignation. The man who had once commanded such confidence suddenly looked very small and very alone. But even in defeat, Blagojevich couldn't resist the spotlight. Outside the courthouse, he delivered what many considered his final political speech, proclaiming his innocence and comparing himself to historical figures who had been wrongly persecuted. The delusion was complete, even facing years in federal prison. He remained convinced he was the victim rather than the perpetrator. The sentence came down 4 months later, 14 years in federal prison. Judge James Zagel, in delivering the sentence, spoke words that still echo in my mind: when it is the governor who goes bad, the fabric of Illinois is torn and disfigured. The courtroom was silent, except for the quiet sobbing of Blagojevich's daughters, innocent victims of their father's insatiable greed. As I followed up on the case over the years, I learned that the damage extended far beyond Blagojevich himself. Public trust in Illinois government, already fragile, was shattered. Legitimate state programs suffered as federal oversight increased. Most tragically, the people who needed government services the most, the poor, the sick, the vulnerable, continued to pay the price for one man's corruption long after he was behind bars. The Blagojevich case revealed something terrifying about the nature of political power in America. It showed how easily our democratic institutions could be perverted by someone willing to abandon all ethical constraints. Every phone call the FBI recorded was a reminder that the people we elect to serve us sometimes see us only as resources to be exploited. Years later, in January 2020, President Trump commuted Blagojevich's sentence, claiming the punishment was excessive. The former governor emerged from prison largely unrepentant, still insisting he had done nothing wrong. In interviews, he continued to portray himself as a victim of political persecution, rather than acknowledging the very real harm his actions had caused to the people of Illinois. But the story doesn't end with his release. The systemic corruption that allowed Blagojevich to operate for so long remains largely unchanged. Illinois politics continues to be plagued by scandal after scandal, each one a reminder that the culture Blagojevich both thrived in and helped create still exists. As I sit here tonight, writing about these events more than a decade later, I'm struck by how prescient this case was. It foreshadowed an era where the line between public service and personal enrichment would become increasingly blurred, where political leaders would openly discuss using government power for personal gain, where corruption would be defended as merely the way things work. The Blagojevich case wasn't just about one corrupt governor. It was a warning about what happens when we allow political power to operate without meaningful oversight. When we become so accustomed to low-level corruption that we fail to recognize when it metastasizes into something truly monstrous. In the quiet hours of that October night, when I first began investigating this story, I thought I was documenting a simple case of political corruption. What I discovered was something far more disturbing, a glimpse into the dark heart of power itself, and a chilling preview of political scandals yet to come. The ghost of Rod Blagojevich still haunts Illinois politics, a reminder that the people we trust with power sometimes harbor the darkest intentions. His crimes weren't just against the law. They were against the very idea that government should serve the people rather than exploit them. And somewhere in the shadows of political power, others are watching, learning, adapting. The Blagoje playbook, the casual corruption, the monetization of public office, the complete disregard for democratic norms has become a template for those who see politics not as public service, but as the ultimate con game. The scariest part, he was just the one who got caught. The fog rolled in thick from San Francisco Bay that November morning in 1978, swallowing the city's hills in a gray shroud that seemed almost prophetic. I was standing outside the People's Temple headquarters on Geary Boulevard, staring at the abandoned building that had once housed one of the most powerful political machines in California. What I didn't know then was that I was looking at the epicenter of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and ended in the largest mass murder-suicide in American history until 9/11's. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about Jim Jones and his cult. It's about how political power, corruption, and religious fanaticism combined to create a monster that politicians, law enforcement, and even federal agencies chose to ignore until it was far too late. It's about Congressman Leo Ryan, a man whose dedication to the truth cost him his life, and about the political establishment that failed him and the 918 people who died in the jungles of Guyana. I had been investigating the People's Temple for months when I first encountered the name Leo Ryan, a Democratic congressman from California's 11th district. Ryan had built a reputation as a fearless investigator who wasn't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. He had a habit of putting himself directly into dangerous situations to understand them firsthand. He had gone undercover in Folsom Prison to expose conditions there, and had personally investigated conditions in mental health facilities by having himself committed under a false identity. But it was his investigation into Jim Jones and the People's Temple that would ultimately cost him his life. And the more I dug into the political connections surrounding this case, the more I realized that Ryan's murder wasn't just a tragic end to a cult story. It was the silencing of a man who had discovered something that powerful people desperately wanted to keep hidden. The relationship between Jim Jones and the San Francisco political establishment was deeper and more corrupt than most people realized. Jones had positioned himself as a progressive religious leader, someone who preached racial integration and social justice. But behind the facade, he was building a sophisticated operation that combined religious manipulation with political influence, peddling on a scale that would make modern lobbyists envious. I remember sitting in the basement archives of the San Francisco Chronicle, surrounded by yellowing newspaper clippings and photographs from the 1970s. The images showed Jones standing next to mayors, congressmen, and other political figures, all of them smiling for the cameras. What struck me most was how comfortable they looked together, how natural the relationships appeared. These weren't just photo opportunities. These were real political alliances built on mutual benefit and, I would later discover, mutual corruption. Jones had delivered thousands of votes to San Francisco politicians through his congregation. Members of the People's Temple were organized into a voting bloc that could swing local elections. And Jones used this power to curry favor with everyone from Mayor George Moscone to District Attorney Joseph Freitas. In exchange, the temple received favorable treatment from city agencies, tax exemptions, and most importantly, protection from investigation. The political protection ran so deep that when complaints about the temple began surfacing, reports of child abuse, forced labor, financial fraud, they were consistently buried or dismissed. Former temple members who tried to speak out found themselves ignored by law enforcement, discredited by politicians who owed their careers to Jones's electoral support, or worse, threatened and intimidated by the temple's own security apparatus. One of the most disturbing documents I uncovered was a letter from Jim Jones to then-President Jimmy Carter, offering the services of the People's Temple in advancing the administration's foreign policy goals in South America. Jones presented himself as a religious leader with unique insights into Latin American affairs, someone who could help the United States build relationships in the region. What he didn't mention was that he was already planning to move his entire operation to Guyana, where he was building what would become known as Jonestown. The political connections weren't limited to local San Francisco politics. Jones had cultivated relationships with federal officials, including members of Congress and State Department personnel. He positioned the People's Temple as a progressive, religious organization committed to racial equality and social justice, causes that aligned perfectly with the liberal political establishment of the 1970s. But Leo Ryan was different. When concerned family members approached him about relatives who had joined the temple and moved to Guyana, Ryan didn't dismiss their concerns or refer them to other agencies. He listened. He investigated. And what he discovered horrified him. I interviewed Jackie Spire, who was Ryan's aide at the time and would later become a congresswoman herself. She described to me the meticulous way Ryan approached the investigation, how he insisted on getting first-hand information rather than relying on second-hand reports. Leo believed that, as a representative of the people, he had a responsibility to protect his constituents, even if it meant putting himself in danger. She told me during our conversation in her Washington, D.C. office. The weight of survivors' guilt was still evident in her voice decades later. Ryan's investigation revealed a pattern of abuse and control within the People's Temple that went far beyond religious extremism. He discovered evidence of financial fraud, child abuse, forced labor, and systematic brainwashing. But most disturbing of all, he found evidence that suggested Jones was planning something catastrophic, a revolutionary suicide that would eliminate his entire congregation if he felt threatened by outside investigation. The congressman's requests for information from federal agencies were met with stonewalling and bureaucratic delays. The State Department, which should have been monitoring American citizens living in a foreign commune, claimed they had no concerns about the situation in Guyana. The FBI, despite receiving numerous complaints about the People's Temple's activities, had conducted only minimal investigation into Jones's organization. What I discovered through my investigation was that this wasn't mere bureaucratic incompetence, it was willful blindness. Federal agencies had classified Jim Jones as a political ally, someone who could be useful in advancing American interests in South America during the Cold War. His anti-communist rhetoric and his willingness to establish an American presence in a region dominated by Soviet influence made him valuable enough that his other activities were overlooked. The corruption extended into the highest levels of the California state government. I found documents showing that state agencies responsible for child welfare and financial oversight had received complaints about the People's Temple, but had failed to act on them. Politicians who had benefited from temple support actively worked to suppress investigations and discredit temple defectors who tried to speak out. By November 1978, Ryan had assembled enough evidence to justify a congressional investigation into the People's Temple. But Jones, monitoring the situation from his compound in Guyana, knew that such an investigation would expose not only his own crimes, but also the political corruption that had enabled them. The decision was made to eliminate Ryan before he could return to Washington with his findings. The events of November 18, 1978, unfolded with a precision that suggested extensive planning. Ryan and his delegation had arrived in Guyana to conduct a fact-finding mission to Jonestown. Initially, they were given a carefully orchestrated tour designed to show the commune in the best possible light. But cracks in the facade quickly appeared as temple members began secretly approaching the delegation, begging for help to escape. I spoke with survivors of that day, people who witnessed the careful choreography that preceded the massacre. They described how Jones's demeanor changed as it became clear that Ryan's investigation was uncovering the truth about conditions at Jonestown. The man who had presented himself as a benevolent religious leader was revealed as a paranoid dictator, willing to kill anyone who threatened his control. The attack on Ryan and his delegation at the Port Kaituma airstrip was brutal and efficient. Temple gunmen opened fire on the congressman and his party as they prepared to board planes with defectors who had asked for help escaping Jonestown. Ryan was shot multiple times at close range, execution style. NBC reporter Don Harris and cameraman Bob Brown were also killed. Their murders captured on film by Brown's camera as he continued filming even as he was shot. But Ryan's murder was just the beginning of the horror. Back at Jonestown, Jones initiated the final phase of his plan, the forced poisoning of his entire congregation, including over 300 children. The audio recordings of that final hour, preserved on the tape Jones made to document his revolutionary suicide, revealed the true nature of what happened. The screaming children, the parents forced to poison their own babies, the armed guards preventing anyone from escaping. This wasn't suicide. It was mass murder. What makes this story even more chilling is how preventable it all was. Ryan's investigation had uncovered clear evidence of the danger Jones posed months before the massacre. Federal agencies had received detailed reports about conditions at Jonestown from defectors and concerned family members. The signs of impending catastrophe were there for anyone willing to look. If this systematic cover-up and its tragic consequences are disturbing you as much as they disturbed me during my investigation, make sure you subscribe to Criminal Nights so you never miss another deep dive into the darkest corners of political crime. But the political establishment chose to protect their ally rather than the American citizens under his control. The votes Jones had delivered, the political support he had provided, the useful anti-communist rhetoric he had spouted, all of this made him too valuable to sacrifice for the sake of a few complaints from disgruntled former followers and worried family members. The aftermath of the Jonestown massacre revealed the full extent of the political corruption that had enabled Jones to operate with impunity for so long. Congressional investigations uncovered a pattern of willful negligence by federal agencies, deliberate suppression of complaints by state and local authorities, and active collaboration between Jones and political figures who should have been investigating him instead of protecting him. I found documents showing that Mayor George Moscone had received detailed reports about abuses within the People's Temple as early as 1977, but had taken no action because Jones's political support was too valuable to lose. District Attorney Joseph Freitas had similarly ignored evidence of criminal activity within the temple, despite receiving multiple complaints from former members. The State Department's handling of the situation was, perhaps, the most egregious example of political corruption leading directly to mass murder. Despite receiving warnings from defectors about the dangerous conditions at Jonestown Department, officials had consistently downplayed the concerns and refused to take action that might have saved lives. Internal memos revealed that officials were more concerned about maintaining good relations with the Guyanese government than protecting American citizens. The FBI's failure to properly investigate the People's Temple was equally damning, despite having an extensive file on Jones dating back to the 1960s. The Bureau had classified him as a low-priority target. Agents had received detailed reports about criminal activity within the temple, but had failed to act on them, apparently viewing Jones as a useful informant rather than a threat to public safety. What emerged from the congressional investigations was a picture of systematic failure that went to the very heart of how American political institutions were supposed to protect citizens from exactly this kind of predatory organization. Every level of government, from local police to federal agencies, had failed in their basic duty to investigate credible reports of criminal activity. The personal cost of this political corruption was devastating. I interviewed family members of Jonestown victims who had tried for years to get authorities to investigate their loved one's situation. They described a consistent pattern of being dismissed, ignored, or actively discouraged from pursuing their concerns. Their relatives died because politicians were more interested in protecting their political ally than protecting American citizens. Grace Stone, whose custody battle over her son John had been one of the catalysts for Ryan's investigation, broke down as she described her years-long struggle to get authorities to take her seriously. "They treated me like I was the crazy one," she told me during our interview at her Northern California home. "My son was being held against his will in a foreign country, and everyone from the police to the State Department acted like I was making it all up." John Stowen was among the children murdered at Jonestown. The conspiracy to protect Jim Jones extended beyond just ignoring complaints. There was active collaboration in suppressing information that might have exposed the truth about the People's Temple. I discovered evidence that local media outlets had been pressured not to investigate the temple too aggressively, that potential whistleblowers had been intimidated, and that government agencies had shared information about temple critics with Jones's organization. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery that some federal officials had advanced knowledge of Jones's plans for a mass suicide, but had failed to take action to prevent it. Internal communications revealed discussions about the possibility of violence at Jonestown, but these concerns were never translated into concrete protective measures for American citizens living there. The murder of Leo Ryan represented more than just the silencing of one congressman. It was the elimination of the one person in government who had been willing to prioritize the truth over political convenience. Ryan's investigation had threatened to expose not just Jones's crimes, but the entire network of political corruption that had enabled them. In the days following the Jonestown massacre, there was a brief moment when it seemed like the full truth might come out. Congressional hearings were scheduled, investigations were promised, and politicians lined up to express their outrage at the tragedy. But as the immediate shock wore off, the focus shifted away from the political failures that had enabled the massacre and toward safer targets: mental health issues, religious extremism, anything that didn't implicate the political establishment itself. The final congressional report on Jonestown was a masterpiece of bureaucratic whitewashing. While it acknowledged various failures of communication and bureaucratic shortcomings, it stopped short of holding any specific officials accountable for the decisions that had directly contributed to the massacre. The systemic corruption that had protected Jones for years was reframed as isolated incidents of poor judgment. I spent months tracking down the survivors of Ryan's delegation, the people who had witnessed firsthand the congressman's dedication to uncovering the truth. Jackie Spire, who had been shot 5 times during the airstrip attack, but survived, described to me the methodical way Ryan had approached the investigation. "He knew he was taking a risk," she said, "but he felt that protecting his constituents was more important than protecting himself." The cover-up continued even after the massacre. Federal agencies destroyed or classified documents related to their pre-massacre knowledge of conditions at Jonestown. Officials who had been responsible for oversight of the situation were quietly transferred or promoted rather than held accountable. The political figures who had protected Jones were allowed to distance themselves from the tragedy without facing serious consequences. What makes the Jonestown massacre even more tragic is that it wasn't the result of religious fanaticism alone. It was the predictable outcome of a system where political connections could shield criminal behavior from investigation and prosecution. Jim Jones wasn't just a cult leader. He was a sophisticated political operative who understood how to use the system to protect himself while preying on vulnerable people. The lessons of Jonestown extend far beyond the specific tragedy of November 18, 1978. They reveal how easily our political institutions can be corrupted when personal and partisan interests are prioritized over public safety. They show how the most vulnerable members of society, the poor, the minorities, the powerless, become victims not just of individual predators, but of systemic failures to protect them. As I concluded my investigation into this case, I was struck by how many warning signs had been ignored. How many opportunities to prevent the massacre had been squandered because of political considerations. Leo Ryan's murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symbol of what happens when courage and integrity threaten entrenched corruption. The ghosts of Jonestown still haunt American politics today. The same dynamics that allowed Jim Jones to operate with impunity, the prioritization of political expedience over public safety, the willingness to ignore inconvenient truths, the treatment of vulnerable populations as expendable, continue to manifest in different forms. Today, when I drive past that abandoned People's Temple building on Geary Boulevard, I think about the 918 people who died in the jungles of Guyana, and about the congressman who died trying to save them. I think about the political establishment that failed them all, and about the lessons we still haven't learned about the corrupting influence of power. The fog still rolls in from San Francisco Bay, obscuring the city in gray shadows that seem to whisper of secrets still hidden, of truths still suppressed, of the price we pay when political convenience matters more than human life. And in those shadows, I can almost hear Leo Ryan's voice, still asking the questions that got him killed, still demanding the accountability that never came. The most chilling aspect of the Jonestown massacre isn't just that it happened, it's how easily it could happen again, in a different form, with different players, but with the same fundamental dynamic of political protection, enabling predatory behavior until it's too late to save the victims. The dead of Jonestown are still waiting for justice, and their story is far from over. The snow was falling heavily on Washington, D.C., that January evening in 1990, when I first heard the name Marion Barry spoken in hushed tones in the back rooms of federal buildings. I was investigating a story that would consume the next 2 years of my life, a tale of political power, drug addiction, corruption, and ultimately murder that reached into the highest levels of the nation's capital. What I thought would be a simple story about a mayor's drug problem became something far darker, a conspiracy involving federal agents, foreign governments, and a web of violence that claimed lives and destroyed careers. Marion Barry wasn't just any mayor when the FBI's sting operation finally brought him down. He was a civil rights icon, a man who had marched with Martin Luther King Jr., who had dedicated his life to lifting up the African American community in Washington, D.C. But by 1990, he had become something else entirely, the center of a criminal empire that used city government as a front for drug trafficking, money laundering, and political assassination. The Vista Hotel on Thomas Circle had been transformed into a stage set for political theater on the night of January 18, 1990. Room 727 was wired with cameras and recording equipment as FBI agents prepared to capture what they hoped would be the final act in a years-long investigation. But what they recorded that night was more than just a mayor smoking crack cocaine. It was the unraveling of a conspiracy that had been decades in the making. I remember sitting in that hotel room months later, after the FBI had released it back to civilian use. The carpet had been replaced, the walls repainted, but I could still feel the weight of what had happened there. This wasn't just where a mayor had been arrested. It was where the facade of respectability had finally crumbled, revealing the rotting corruption underneath. The woman at the center of that night's operation was Rashida Moore, a former girlfriend of Barry's who had been recruited by the FBI to lure him into their trap. But Moore wasn't just a cooperating witness. She was a survivor of something far more sinister than simple drug dealing. She had witnessed murders, been threatened with death herself, and knew secrets about Barry's organization that went far beyond what the FBI was investigating. During my investigation, I managed to interview Moore at a safe house in Virginia, surrounded by federal marshals who were protecting her from what they described as credible threats to her life. Her hands shook as she lit cigarette after cigarette, her eyes constantly darting to the windows as she spoke. "You don't understand what Marion was really involved in," she told me, her voice barely above a whisper. "The drugs were just the beginning. There were things happening that made the crack look like candy." What Moore revealed to me over the course of several interviews was a criminal organization that used the mayor's office as its headquarters. Barry hadn't just been using drugs, he had been facilitating their distribution throughout the city, using his political position to protect dealers and suppliers while taking a percentage of their profits. But the drug operation was connected to something even more dangerous. Foreign intelligence services who were using Barry's organization to funnel money and influence into American politics. The story began in the late 1970s, when Barry was consolidating his political power in Washington, D.C. He had cultivated relationships with various Caribbean and South American political figures, ostensibly as part of his efforts to build international connections for the city. But intelligence sources I spoke with revealed that some of these relationships were actually covers for drug trafficking operations that were smuggling cocaine into the United States through D.C. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Barry organization was how it dealt with threats to its operations. Former associates who tried to leave the organization, journalists who got too close to the truth, law enforcement officers who couldn't be bought. They had a habit of dying in accidents, suicides, or unsolved murders that Washington, D.C. police consistently failed to investigate properly. I compiled a list of 15 people connected to Barry's organization who died under suspicious circumstances between 1985 and 1990. Car accidents where the brakes had mysteriously failed, apparent suicides by people who had never shown signs of depression, drug overdoses of people who friends swore were clean. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look, but the Metropolitan Police Department seemed determined not to see it. Detective Frank Williams had been one of the few D.C. police officers willing to investigate the suspicious deaths connected to Barry's organization. I found him living in a small apartment in Baltimore, forced into early retirement after what his superiors had called paranoid delusions about the mayor. Williams showed me boxes of files he had assembled over years of investigation, photographs, witness statements, forensic reports that had been buried or ignored. They didn't want us looking too closely at anything connected to the mayor, Williams told me as we sat in his cramped living room, surrounded by evidence that should have been in police custody. Every time we got close to something, the order came down from above to focus on other cases. When I kept pushing, they transferred me to traffic duty and then forced me out altogether. Williams's files revealed a sophisticated operation that used intimidation, bribery, and when necessary, murder to protect Barry's criminal enterprise. City contracts were awarded to companies that agreed to launder drug money. Police investigations were derailed by orders from the chief's office. Prosecutors found their cases mysteriously lacking evidence when they went to trial. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was the extent to which federal agencies were aware of Barry's activities, but chose to ignore them for political reasons. Barry was a prominent African-American political figure during a time when the Reagan administration was trying to improve its relationship with black voters. Prosecuting him for drug offenses would have been politically explosive, so various agencies looked the other way, while his organization grew more powerful and more dangerous. The D had been tracking Barry's drug connections since 1987, but their investigation had been repeatedly stalled by pressure from Justice Department officials who were concerned about the political implications of targeting such a high-profile figure. Internal memos I obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests showed that agents were frustrated by the limitations placed on their investigation. Agent Michael Harrison, who had led the DEA's initial investigation into Barry's drug connections, agreed to speak with me only after his retirement from the agency. We met at a diner in Northern Virginia, where he spoke with the bitterness of a man who had watched politics trump law enforcement. We knew what Barry was doing, he told me. We had informants, we had surveillance, we had financial records. But every time we asked for authorization to move forward, we were told it wasn't the right time politically. What Harrison revealed was that the federal government had been using Barry as an intelligence asset, tolerating his criminal activities in exchange for information about other political figures and foreign contacts. Barry's international connections, which had initially appeared to be legitimate diplomatic relationships, were actually opportunities for various federal agencies. The arrangement worked well until Barry's drug use became so public that it could no longer be ignored. Even then, the initial plan wasn't to prosecute him but to quietly force him out of office and into rehabilitation. The Vista Hotel sting operation was meant to be a controlled intervention, not a criminal prosecution. But Barry's reaction to being caught changed everything. Instead of quietly accepting a deal that would have allowed him to leave office with his reputation partially intact, he chose to fight. And in fighting, he threatened to expose the federal agencies that had been protecting him, the political figures who had been collaborating with him, and the full extent of the criminal organization that had been operating out of the mayor's office. That's when people started dying. The first victim was James Mitchell, a former Barry associate who had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators. Mitchell was found dead in his apartment on February 3, 1990, just 2 weeks after Barry's arrest. The medical examiner ruled it a drug overdose, but people who knew Mitchell insisted he had been clean for months. More disturbing, Mitchell had told friends that he was planning to reveal information about murders committed by Barry's organization. Mitchell's death was followed by a string of others, each more suspicious than the last. Maria Santos, a city employee who had been cooperating with the FBI's corruption investigation, died in a car accident when her brakes failed on the Beltway. Robert Johnson, a journalist who had been investigating Barry's foreign connections, committed suicide by jumping from his apartment balcony, despite having no history of depression and having just signed a book contract about his investigation by the time of Barry's trial. 6 people connected to the case had died under circumstances that investigators found suspicious but were unable to prove were homicides. The pattern was clear, but no one in law enforcement seemed willing to acknowledge it publicly. The official position was that these were tragic coincidences, unrelated to the Barry investigation. If you're as shocked by this web of political murder and corruption as I was when I first uncovered it, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another Criminal Nights investigation into the darkest corners of political power. I managed to obtain copies of FBI surveillance footage from the months leading up to Barry's arrest, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. The tapes showed Barry meeting with individuals that intelligence sources later identified as foreign operatives, weapons dealers, and high-level drug traffickers. These weren't social meetings, they were business negotiations that involved millions of dollars and potentially thousands of lives. One particularly disturbing piece of surveillance footage showed Barry meeting with Viktor Kozlov, a Russian intelligence operative who was later expelled from the United States for espionage activities. The meeting took place in Rock Creek Park in November 1989, just 2 months before Barry's arrest. Intelligence sources told me that Kozlov was part of a Soviet effort to establish intelligence networks within American municipal governments, using drug money and corruption to compromise local officials. The implications were staggering. If the intelligence sources were correct, Barry hadn't just been a corrupt mayor, he had been a foreign intelligence asset, potentially providing the Soviet Union with access to sensitive information about federal government operations in the D.C. area. His drug organization hadn't just been about money, it had been about espionage. But the most disturbing revelation came from analyzing the timing of the suspicious deaths connected to Barry's organization. Each death occurred shortly after the victim had been contacted by federal investigators or had indicated a willingness to cooperate with law enforcement. The pattern suggested that Barry's organization had inside information about the federal investigation. Someone within law enforcement was feeding information to the targets of the investigation. Internal affairs investigations within both the FBI and the Metropolitan Police Department revealed that Barry's organization had been paying bribes to law enforcement officials for years. But the scope of the corruption went beyond simple bribery. There were indications that some officers and agents had been actively participating in the criminal organization's activities. Lieutenant Charles Washington of the Metropolitan Police department had been Barry's primary law enforcement contact, using his position to protect the mayor's drug operations and eliminate threats to the organization. Washington had access to federal investigation files through interagency cooperation agreements, which he used to identify potential witnesses and informants who posed a danger to Barry. When investigators finally moved to arrest Washington in connection with these suspicious deaths, they found that he had already fled the country. Intelligence sources later confirmed that Washington had been given asylum in Cuba, where he remained beyond the reach of American law enforcement. Before his departure, Washington had destroyed most of the files that could have proven the connection between Barry's organization and the suspicious deaths. The trial of Marion Barry became a carefully orchestrated piece of political theater designed to obscure the true nature of his criminal organization. Federal prosecutors focused narrowly on the drug charges, avoiding any mention of the murders, the foreign intelligence connections, or the broader corruption that had enabled Barry's operations. Barry's defense team, meanwhile, portrayed him as a victim of racial persecution, a civil rights hero who had been brought down by a racist federal government. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, by making the trial about race rather than crime. Barry's lawyers ensured that the jury would focus on political considerations rather than criminal evidence. The jury's verdict, guilty on only one misdemeanor drug possession charge, was seen by many as a vindication of Barry's claims of persecution. But what the jury didn't know was the full scope of the criminal organization they were effectively protecting. The murders, the foreign intelligence connections, the systematic corruption of city government. None of it was presented as evidence. Barry served 6 months in federal prison and returned to Washington as a hero to many in the African American community. He was re-elected mayor in 1994, a stunning comeback that demonstrated the power of his political machine. But those of us who knew the truth about his organization understood that his return to power represented something far more sinister than political resilience. During Barry's second tenure as mayor, the suspicious deaths continued. Activists who criticized his administration, journalists who investigated city contracts, former associates who might have revealed damaging information, they continued to die in accidents and suicides that investigators found suspicious but were unable to prove were homicides. The most chilling case was that of Sarah Williams, a community activist who had been organizing opposition to Barry's re-election campaign. Williams had publicly accused Barry of using city resources to facilitate drug dealing in low-income neighborhoods. 2 weeks after making these accusations, at a city council meeting, Williams was found dead in her apartment, apparently from a drug overdose. The problem was that Williams had never used drugs in her life. Friends and family insisted that she was a health-conscious person who didn't even drink alcohol. More disturbing, the drugs found in her system weren't typical street drugs. They were pharmaceutical compounds that would have required sophisticated knowledge to administer. The medical examiner's report raised more questions than it answered. The drug levels in Williams's system were far higher than would have been necessary to cause death, suggesting that whoever killed her had wanted to ensure that there would be no chance of survival. The injection site on her arm showed signs of struggle, indicating that the drugs had been administered against her will. But perhaps most chilling of all was the discovery of a note in Williams's apartment, apparently written in her own handwriting, apologizing for her lies about Mayor Barry and asking for forgiveness. Handwriting experts I consulted found subtle inconsistencies in the note that suggested it had been written under duress, or possibly forged entirely. Williams's death followed the same pattern as the other suspicious deaths connected to Barry's organization: a clear motive for murder, physical evidence that contradicted the official cause of death, and a complete lack of serious investigation by local law enforcement. The case was closed within a week, with no arrests and no further investigation. By the time Barry left office for the final time in 1998, I had documented 23 suspicious deaths connected to his organization. Car accidents, drug overdoses, suicides, heart attacks, house fires, the variety of methods suggested a sophisticated operation with access to professional killers and advanced techniques for making murders look like accidents. But the most disturbing aspect of the Berry case wasn't just the murders. It was the systematic cover-up that protected the killers and allowed them to continue operating. Federal agencies that should have been investigating these crimes were instead protecting their intelligence asset. Local law enforcement agencies that should have been solving murders were instead being paid to ignore them. The culture of corruption that Berry created in Washington, D.C. didn't end with his departure from office. The networks he established, the precedents he set, the methods he pioneered for using government positions to facilitate criminal enterprises, they all became part of the city's political landscape. Today, when I walk through downtown Washington, D.C., I can still see the legacy of Marion Berry's criminal organization. Buildings that were constructed with laundered drug money, businesses that were fronts for illegal operations, neighborhoods that were systematically destroyed by the drug trade that Berry facilitated and protected. But most chilling of all are the unmarked graves of the people who died because they threatened Berry's operation. They were buried as accident victims, suicide cases, drug overdoses, their true cause of death, hidden by a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of local and federal government. The Vista Hotel still stands on Thomas Circle. It's room 7, now just another anonymous hotel room where tourists and business travelers sleep peacefully, unaware of the history that unfolded there. But I know that on cold winter nights, when the snow falls on Washington, D.C., like it did on that January evening in 1990, the ghosts of Berry's victims still walk the halls of power, seeking the justice they never received in life. The most terrifying aspect of the Marion Berry case is how easily it could be replicated in any major American city. The combination of political protection, law enforcement corruption, and federal agency complicity that enabled Berry's criminal organization to operate with impunity for decades exists in municipalities across the country. Marion Berry died in 2014, taking most of his secrets with him to the grave. But the people he killed, the lives he destroyed, the democracy he corrupted, their stories live on as a warning about what happens when political power becomes indistinguishable from criminal enterprise. The snow still falls on Washington, D.C. every winter, covering the city in a clean white blanket that makes everything look pure and innocent. But underneath that snow, buried in unmarked graves and hidden in classified files, lie the bodies and the secrets of one of the most successful criminal organizations in American political history. And in the shadows of the nation's capital, others are watching, learning, adapting, preparing to build their own criminal empires on the foundation that Marion Berry laid with blood, corruption, and the systematic murder of anyone brave enough to tell the truth. The autumn leaves were burning in small piles along the winding roads of rural Pennsylvania when I first heard whispers about Governor Tom Ridge and what federal agents were calling Operation Keystone. It was October 2001, and the nation was still reeling from the September 11th attacks. What I didn't know then was that I was about to uncover a conspiracy that used the chaos and fear of those dark days to mask one of the most sophisticated political assassination plots in American history. Ridge wasn't just any governor when the scheme began to unfold. He was being considered for a cabinet position in the newly formed Department of Homeland Security. A man whose political future seemed limitless. But by the time I finished my investigation 2 years later, I had documented evidence of murder, international conspiracy, and a cover-up that reached into the highest levels of the federal government. The story begins with a name that most Americans have never heard, Viktor Kozłowski, not the Russian agent from the Berry case, but a Polish intelligence operative who had been working within Pennsylvania state government since 1998. Kozłowski's official title was International Trade Liaison, a position that gave him access to state contracts, federal security briefings, and most importantly, Governor Ridge's inner circle. I remember the first time I saw Kozłowski's photograph in a classified FBI file that was leaked to me by a source I still cannot name. His face was ordinary, forgettable, exactly the kind of appearance that would allow someone to blend into political circles without attracting attention. But his eyes held a coldness that I would later recognize in other intelligence operatives I encountered during this investigation. What made Kozłowski dangerous wasn't just his intelligence training. It was his understanding of American political psychology. He had studied at the University of Chicago before returning to Poland in the 1990s, where he was recruited by the SB, Poland's intelligence service. His handlers had spent years positioning him for an operation that would destabilize American homeland security efforts in their earliest, most vulnerable stages. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: assassinate Tom Ridge during his transition to Homeland Security Secretary, making it appear to be the work of Islamic terrorists. The attack would accomplish multiple objectives: eliminating a competent security official, creating additional fear and chaos in the American government, and potentially triggering an overreaction that would damage American relationships with Muslim allies. But like all complex conspiracies, this one required the elimination of potential witnesses and the corruption of American officials who might discover the truth. And that's where the bodies began to pile up. The first victim was Dr. Sarah Chen, a bioweapons expert who had been consulting with Ridge's security team about potential terrorist threats to Pennsylvania's infrastructure. Chen had discovered anomalies in intelligence reports that suggested someone with inside access was manipulating threat assessments. On November 15, 2001, she was found dead in her Philadelphia apartment, apparently from exposure to ricin poison. The FBI's initial investigation into Chen's death focused on the possibility that she had been targeted by foreign terrorists because of her expertise in biological weapons. But what investigators didn't know was that Chen had been preparing a report identifying inconsistencies in intelligence briefings that would have exposed Kozłowski's operation. I obtained copies of Chen's preliminary notes through a source within the FBI, and what I read kept me awake for weeks. Chen had identified a pattern of false intelligence reports that seemed designed to direct security resources away from specific locations and events. More disturbing, she had traced some of these reports back to sources within the Pennsylvania state government. Chen's death was followed by a series of others, each more sophisticated than the last. Michael Torres, a state trooper who provided security for Governor Ridge, died in a hunting accident when his rifle inexplicably misfired and shot him in the head. Jennifer Walsh, a federal prosecutor who had been investigating irregularities in state contracts, was killed when her car exploded in the parking garage of a federal building in Philadelphia. The methods used to kill these potential witnesses demonstrated a level of sophistication that went far beyond typical criminal enterprises. The ricin used to poison Chen was weapons-grade material that required advanced laboratory equipment to produce. The explosive device that killed Walsh was constructed using military-grade plastique that wasn't available to civilian criminals. The rifle malfunction that killed Torres had been caused by a microscopic alteration to the firing mechanism that required expert knowledge of firearms engineering. What made these murders even more chilling was how effectively they were covered up. Each death was investigated by different agencies: local police, state investigators, federal agents, ensuring that no single investigator would see the pattern. Evidence disappeared from evidence rooms, witness statements were altered or lost, and forensic reports contained conclusions that contradicted their own findings. I spent months tracking down the investigators who had worked these cases, and what I discovered was a systematic campaign of intimidation and bribery designed to prevent anyone from connecting the dots. Detective Robert Martinez, who had initially questioned the circumstances of Torres's death, was transferred to a desk job after receiving anonymous threats against his family. FBI agent Lisa Thompson, who had been investigating Walsh's murder, suddenly found herself under internal investigation for unrelated misconduct allegations. But the most disturbing discovery was that Kozłowski hadn't been acting alone. He had cultivated a network of corrupt American officials who were being paid to facilitate his operation. State legislators who ensured that certain contracts went to companies controlled by Polish intelligence, federal agents who provided classified information about security preparations, even members of Ridge's own staff who were feeding intelligence to foreign handlers. The corruption reached into the highest levels of Pennsylvania state government. Lieutenant Governor Mark Schweiker, who would become governor if Ridge was assassinated, had been receiving payments through a complex network of offshore accounts controlled by Polish intelligence services. The payments weren't just bribes. They were advance payments for services that Schweiker would provide after Ridge's death. Internal documents I obtained showed that Schweiker had already prepared executive orders that would have fundamentally altered Pennsylvania's homeland security preparations. Orders that would have created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by foreign intelligence services. The assassination of Ridge wasn't just about eliminating one man. It was about installing a puppet governor who would serve foreign interests. The plot's timeline became clear as I assembled evidence from multiple sources. The assassination was planned for December 20th, 2001. During a public ceremony where Ridge would be announcing Pennsylvania's new homeland security initiatives, Kozłowski had recruited a team of Polish intelligence operatives who would pose as Islamic extremists, using weapons and explosives that could be traced back to Middle Eastern sources. The attack would have been devastating, not just in terms of lives lost, but in its psychological impact on American security preparations. Ridge's death would have created chaos within the newly formed Homeland Security apparatus at its most critical moment, potentially crippling America's ability to respond to future terrorist attacks. But the conspiracy began to unravel when one of the intended assassins had a crisis of conscience. Marek Nowak, a Polish intelligence operative who had been recruited for the mission, contacted the FBI on December 18th, just 2 days before the planned attack. What Nowak revealed in his debriefing sessions would have been front-page news in any normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. If this web of international conspiracy and political murder is as disturbing to you as it was to me when I first uncovered it, make sure you subscribe to Criminal Nights so you never miss another investigation into the shadows of political power. Nowak's revelations came at a time when the Bush administration was struggling to establish credibility for its new homeland security efforts. The last thing they wanted was a public revelation that foreign intelligence services had successfully penetrated state governments and were planning political assassinations on American soil. The decision was made at the highest levels to handle the situation quietly, without public disclosure, rather than arrest Kozłowski and his network publicly. Federal agents launched a covert operation to neutralize the threat, while maintaining the fiction that no such plot had ever existed. The assassination team was quietly detained and deported. Kozłowski himself was found dead in his hotel room on December 19th, apparently from a heart attack, though people familiar with intelligence operations recognized the signs of a more sophisticated termination. The cover-up that followed was masterful in its execution. All evidence of the conspiracy was classified at the highest levels of government. The suspicious deaths that had occurred during the plot's development were reclassified as unrelated incidents. The corrupt American officials who had been collaborating with Polish intelligence were quietly removed from their positions, but were never prosecuted. In exchange for their silence about what they had learned, Governor Ridge was never told about the plot against his life. Federal agents made the decision that informing him about the assassination attempt would compromise operational security and might lead to public disclosures that would damage national security. Ridge continued his transition to Homeland Security Secretary without ever knowing how close he had come to death. But the people who had died to protect the conspiracy, Dr. Sarah Chen, Michael Torres, Jennifer Walsh, and at least 6 others, were buried with the truth about their murders. Their families were told that their loved ones had died in tragic accidents or isolated criminal acts, never knowing that they had been sacrificed to protect a foreign intelligence operation. The psychological profiles I obtained of the victims revealed the careful selection process that Kozłowski had used to identify threats to his operation. Chen had been targeted because her scientific expertise made her uniquely capable of detecting the biological weapons components of the plot. Torres had been killed because his security background gave him access to information about Regis' movements and protection details. Walsh had been murdered because her financial investigations were tracing money flows that could have exposed the foreign funding of the conspiracy. Each victim had been chosen not just for what they knew, but for their potential to uncover additional aspects of the plot. The murders weren't just about silencing witnesses, they were about preventing a cascading series of discoveries that could have unraveled the entire operation. The cleanup operation that followed the foiled assassination attempt was equally systematic. Evidence was destroyed, witnesses were relocated or intimidated into silence, and official records were altered to remove any trace of what had occurred. Even the hotel room where Kozłowski died was completely renovated, with the carpets, wallpaper, and even the bathroom fixtures replaced to eliminate any potential forensic evidence. But the most chilling aspect of the cover-up was how it was used to establish precedents for future operations. The techniques developed to hide the Polish conspiracy, the compartmentalization of investigations, the use of multiple agencies to prevent pattern recognition, the systematic intimidation of witnesses became templates for covering up other sensitive operations. I discovered evidence that similar plots had been developed by other foreign intelligence services, taking advantage of the chaos and security vulnerabilities created by the September 11th attacks. Chinese operatives had been planning an operation targeting California Governor Gray Davis. Russian agents had developed contingency plans for eliminating key federal officials if certain geopolitical conditions were met. Iranian intelligence had been conducting surveillance of nuclear facility administrators in several states. The American response to these threats wasn't to expose them publicly and strengthen democratic institutions against foreign interference. Instead, it was to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of covert neutralization and cover-up, creating a shadow world where foreign intelligence operatives and American security services engaged in deadly games that the public was never allowed to see. The long-term consequences of these decisions are still playing out today. The precedent of handling foreign assassination plots through covert action rather than public prosecution created a culture of secrecy that has made it increasingly difficult to distinguish between legitimate national security operations and illegal cover-ups of government failures. More disturbing still is the realization that the corrupt American officials who had been collaborating with foreign intelligence services were never held accountable for their crimes. Many of them continued to serve in government positions. Some were even promoted to higher levels of responsibility. Their knowledge of how easily American political systems could be penetrated and manipulated made them valuable assets for future operations. Lieutenant Governor Schweiker, who had been positioned to become a puppet governor serving foreign interests, completed his term as Ridge's successor without ever facing consequences for his collaboration with Polish intelligence. The offshore accounts that had been used to pay him were quietly closed. The money disappeared into the black budget world of intelligence operations, and Schweiker was allowed to retire from politics with his reputation intact. The families of the murdered witnesses were never told the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. Dr. Chun's parents still believed their daughter was killed by Islamic terrorists because of her bioweapons expertise. Torres's wife was told that her husband died in a hunting accident. Walsh's children grew up believing their mother was killed by random criminals. These lies weren't just cruel, they were strategically necessary to maintain the cover-up. If the victims' families had known the truth, they might have demanded investigations that could have exposed the broader conspiracy. Their grief was weaponized to maintain the secrecy that protected both foreign intelligence operations and American government failures. The Pennsylvania State Police still maintain files on the hunting accident that killed Michael Torres. The Philadelphia Police Department's unsolved murder files still contain Jennifer Walsh's case, officially attributed to unknown assailants. The FBI's terrorism database still lists Dr. Sarah Chen as a victim of foreign terrorist activity. These false classifications aren't just bureaucratic errors. They're deliberate distortions designed to prevent future investigators from recognizing patterns that might expose the truth. As I concluded my investigation into this case, I was struck by how completely the conspiracy had been erased from official records. If not for the leaked documents and the courage of sources who risked their lives to speak with me, the entire plot would have remained hidden forever. The assassination attempt that came within days of success, the murders of American citizens by foreign agents, the corruption of state and federal officials, all of it would have disappeared into the classified darkness where so many political crimes are buried. Tom Ridge served as Secretary of Homeland Security from 2003 to 2005, never knowing that his appointment to that position had been facilitated by the murder of American citizens and the cover-up of a foreign assassination plot. His policies and decisions as Homeland Security Secretary were shaped by threat assessments that had been manipulated by the very conspiracy that had tried to kill him. The irony is inescapable. The man charged with protecting America from foreign threats had himself been the target of one of the most sophisticated foreign intelligence operations ever conducted on American soil. And the cover-up of that operation had established precedents and procedures that would make future foreign interference easier, not harder. Today, when I drive through the Pennsylvania countryside where this story began, I think about the autumn. Leaves that were burning in those small piles along the roadside. They were destroying the evidence of summer, preparing the landscape for winter, creating the illusion that the past had never existed. It's a perfect metaphor for how political conspiracies are handled in America, burned away, buried, forgotten, leaving only carefully maintained illusions in their place. The cover-up began immediately. The local police investigation was perfunctory and brief. Federal agencies that should have been interested in an attack on a former Senate Majority Leader showed no curiosity about the circumstances. Most telling of all, Reed himself refused to discuss what had happened, claiming he remembered nothing about the incident. But Reed's silence wasn't the result of memory loss. It was the result of threats against his family. Sources close to the senator told me that he had been visited in the hospital by individuals who made it clear that any attempt to reveal the truth about his attack would result in harm to his children and grandchildren. Reed, a tough politician who had never backed down from a fight, had been forced to choose between justice and the safety of his loved ones. The documents Reed had assembled about Morrison's judicial corruption network disappeared during the search of his house. Years of investigation, hundreds of pages of evidence, recorded conversations that could have exposed the truth about dozens of corrupted federal court decisions. All of it vanished into the hands of the people who had orchestrated the attack. But Reed had been smart enough to anticipate that something like this might happen. He had created insurance copies of his most important documents, hiding them in locations known only to a few trusted associates. And one of those associates eventually found the courage to share some of that information with me. If this revelation about the systematic corruption of America's federal judiciary is as shocking to you as it was to me, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a comment with the word shadow so we know you're one of the brave ones willing to confront these dark truths. The files Reed had assembled revealed corruption on a scale that defied comprehension. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Morrison, no relation to Vincent Morrison, had received over $2 million in speaking fees and book advances that could be directly traced to parties who had cases before the court. Federal appellate judges had been provided with insider information about stock trades that netted them millions in profits. District court judges had received lucrative positions for their spouses at companies owned by litigants appearing before them. But the most chilling discovery was the extent to which this corruption had influenced American law and policy. Landmark decisions about corporate liability, environmental regulation, civil rights, and government surveillance had all been shaped by judges who were being blackmailed or bribed by Morrison's organization. The very foundation of American justice had been undermined by a conspiracy that most Americans never suspected existed. The network extended beyond just federal judges, state Supreme Court justices, attorneys general, and even some prosecutors had been compromised by Morrison's operation. The conspiracy had tentacles that reached into every level of the American legal system, creating a shadow judiciary that served the interests of the wealthy and powerful rather than the cause of justice. One of the most disturbing cases involved the 2010 Citizens United decision, which dramatically expanded the influence of money in American politics. Reed's files contained evidence that several justices who voted in favor of that decision had received substantial financial benefits from organizations that would profit from unlimited political spending. The decision that many considered to be the death blow to American democracy had been purchased by the very interests it was designed to benefit. Morrison's organization hadn't just corrupted individual judges, it had shaped the entire trajectory of American law for decades. Environmental protections had been weakened, corporate regulations had been struck down, civil rights protections had been eroded, all through a carefully orchestrated campaign of judicial manipulation that had operated in complete secrecy. The human cost of this corruption was staggering. I documented cases where innocent people had been sent to prison because judges had been paid to ignore evidence of their innocence. Families had been destroyed by court decisions that favored wealthy litigants who had bribed the judges. Environmental disasters had been enabled by judges who ruled in favor of polluting corporations that were paying them. But perhaps most tragic were the cases where judges who had tried to resist corruption had paid with their lives. Judge Sarah Martinez of the Fifth Circuit had been investigating Morrison's network when she died in a suspicious car accident. Judge Michael Thompson of the Eastern District of Virginia had been preparing to expose bribery in his own courthouse when he suffered a fatal heart attack. During a morning jog, these weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic campaign of intimidation and murder designed to keep the judicial corruption network operating smoothly. Any judge who showed signs of independence or integrity became a target for elimination. The victims of the Polish conspiracy are still dead, their murders still unsolved, their families still deceived about how and why they died. The corrupt officials who enabled the plot are still alive, some still serving in government positions, their crimes still unpunished, and their knowledge still valuable to foreign intelligence services, and somewhere in the classified files of federal agencies. The true story of Operation Keystone remains hidden, a reminder that the most dangerous conspiracies aren't the ones that fail dramatically. They're the ones that succeed so completely that most people never learn they existed at all. The autumn leaves are still burning in Pennsylvania, destroying evidence, erasing the past, preparing for the long winter of secrecy that has settled over American democracy, like a shroud that may never be lifted. The desert wind was howling across the Nevada landscape that March evening in 2018 when I received the encrypted message that would lead me into the darkest political conspiracy I had ever investigated. The text was simple. Senator Reed knows. They're coming for him tonight. By the time I reached Las Vegas 12 hours later, Harry Reid was fighting for his life in a hospital bed, the victim of what doctors called a catastrophic exercise accident. What I discovered over the next 18 months would reveal a conspiracy so vast, so deeply embedded in the American political system, that even now, I question whether the full truth can ever be safely told. Harry Reid wasn't just any senator. When the attempt was made on his life, he was the former Senate Majority Leader, a man who had controlled the flow of legislation through Congress for years, who knew where every political body was buried and who had put them there. But more importantly, he was the keeper of secrets that could destroy some of the most powerful people in American politics. And those people had decided that their secrets were worth killing for. The official story was neat, convenient, and completely fabricated. Reid had been exercising with a resistance band in his home gym when the equipment malfunctioned, sending him crashing into a bathroom door and causing severe injuries to his eye and ribs. The local police investigated and found nothing suspicious. The FBI declined to open a case. The media accepted the explanation without question. Case closed. But I had sources within the Nevada political establishment who told a different story. Reid hadn't been alone when he was injured. There had been visitors to his house that afternoon, men in expensive suits who had arrived in black SUVs with government plates. These same sources told me that Reid had been preparing to make public revelations about corruption at the highest levels of the federal government, revelations that would have implicated sitting senators, federal judges, and possibly even Supreme Court justices. The resistance band story began to fall apart as soon as I started investigating seriously. I spoke with Dr. Marcus Thompson, the emergency room physician who had first treated Reid's injuries. Thompson was hesitant to talk at first, but eventually agreed to meet me at a coffee shop far from the hospital where he worked. His hands trembled as he showed me photographs of Reid's injuries, photographs that he had taken secretly because something about the wounds bothered him. "I've seen exercise injuries," Thompson told me, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the coffee shop. "I've seen hundreds of them. These weren't exercise injuries." The pattern of trauma was consistent with being beaten with something hard and cylindrical, maybe a pipe or a bat, and the eye injury looked like it had been caused by deliberate, focused impact, not an accident. Thompson's photographs revealed injuries that told a story of systematic violence, not accidental trauma. Reid's ribs had been broken in a pattern that suggested repeated blows from above, as if he had been on the ground being kicked. His facial injuries showed signs of defensive wounds, cuts on his hands and forearms that indicated he had tried to protect himself from an attacker. But perhaps most disturbing was what Thompson told me about Reid's psychological state when he arrived at the hospital. He was terrified, the doctor recalled, not in pain, not confused, terrified. He kept saying they found out over and over again. When I asked him who found out what, he just shook his head and said the judges. They know about the judges. The reference to judges sent me down a research path that would consume months of my life and put me in danger more than once. What I discovered was that Reid had been investigating a conspiracy that involved the systematic bribery and blackmail of federal judges, a scheme that had been operating for decades and had influenced some of the most important legal decisions in American history. The conspiracy centered around a man named Vincent Morrison, who ran what appeared to be a legitimate political consulting firm in Washington, D.C., but Morrison's real business was providing services to wealthy individuals and corporations who wanted to influence judicial decisions through a network of blackmail, bribery, and intimidation. Morrison had gained control over dozens of federal judges, including several on the Supreme Court. The methods Morrison used were sophisticated and virtually untraceable, rather than crude cash bribes. He arranged for judges' family members to receive lucrative business opportunities, speaking fees, book deals, and consulting contracts. He provided compromising information about judges' personal lives that could be used to ensure compliance with his clients' wishes. Most chillingly, he arranged for the elimination of judges who couldn't be bought or blackmailed. I obtained documents that showed Morrison's organization had been responsible for at least 7 suspicious deaths of federal judges over the past 15 years. Judge Patricia Williams of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, who had been preparing to expose corruption in federal contracting, died in a skiing accident when her bindings mysteriously failed. Judge Robert Chen of the Federal District Court in New York, who had been investigating money laundering by major banks, suffered a fatal heart attack despite having no history of cardiac problems. Each death had been carefully designed to appear accidental or natural, but the pattern was unmistakable when viewed collectively. Judges who threatened powerful interests died in ways that prevented autopsies, destroyed evidence, or occurred in circumstances where thorough investigation was impossible. Reed had stumbled onto Morrison's operation while investigating campaign finance violations in Nevada. His staff had discovered financial connections between Morrison's clients and several major judicial decisions that had benefited those clients. What started as a routine investigation into political corruption had revealed something far more sinister. The systematic subversion of the American judicial system. The information Reed had gathered was damning enough to destroy dozens of political careers and potentially invalidate years of federal court decisions. He had documented payments to judges' family members, recorded conversations between Morrison and his clients discussing specific cases, and most damaging of all, he had obtained Morrison's insurance files, detailed records of every judge who had been compromised, along with the methods used to control them. But Reed's investigation had been noticed by the wrong people. Morrison's clients included some of the most powerful individuals in American politics and business, people who had billions of dollars at stake and who viewed murder as just another business expense. The decision was made to eliminate Reed before he could go public with his findings. The attack on Reed was carried out by a team of professionals who specialized in making murders look like accidents. I tracked down one of the paramedics who had responded to the initial emergency call, and what he told me confirmed my worst suspicions about what had really happened in Reed's house that day. The scene was wrong, the paramedic told me during a clandestine meeting in a parking garage in Las Vegas. The exercise equipment was set up like it was supposed to look like an accident, but it was too perfect. Real accidents are messy, chaotic. This looked like someone had arranged everything after the fact. More disturbing, the paramedic had noticed signs that Reed's house had been searched. Drawers were slightly open, papers were scattered in ways that suggested someone had been looking for something specific, and Reed's home office had been completely ransacked. Whatever Reed's attackers had been looking for, they had taken the time to search for it thoroughly before calling for medical assistance. The scope of Morrison's operation became clear when I obtained his client list. Major corporations, foreign governments, organized crime syndicates, political action committees, anyone with enough money and a need to influence court decisions could purchase justice through Morrison's network. The American legal system had been transformed into a marketplace where verdicts went to the highest bidder. Reed's attack hadn't just been about silencing one senator, it had been about protecting an entire system of corruption that generated billions of dollars in profits for Morrison's clients. The judicial decisions that had been purchased through bribery and blackmail had influenced everything from tax policy to environmental regulation, creating enormous financial benefits for those wealthy enough to buy their own judges. The investigation into Reed's attack revealed the sophisticated methods used to identify and neutralize threats to the corruption network. Morrison's organization employed former intelligence operatives who maintained surveillance on judges, prosecutors, and politicians who might pose a danger to their operations. They had access to classified government databases that allowed them to monitor investigations and identify potential whistleblowers. When surveillance revealed someone who might expose the network, a graduated response was implemented. First came character assassination, leaked stories about personal problems, ethics violations, or professional incompetence. If that didn't work, financial pressure was applied, audits by the IRS, investigations by regulatory agencies, lawsuits that drained victims' resources. Physical intimidation was the next step. break-ins threatening messages, attacks on family members. Murder was reserved for cases where other methods had failed, and the threat was considered existential. But when that line was crossed, the killings were carried out with professional efficiency that made them nearly impossible to investigate or prosecute. Reed had crossed that line when his investigation had gotten too close to exposing the network's highest-level assets. The attack on him had been designed to either kill him or intimidate him into silence. When he survived, the threats against his family ensured his continued cooperation with the cover-up. The aftermath of Reed's attack saw a systematic purge of anyone who might have knowledge about his investigation. Staff members who had worked on judicial corruption issues were transferred to other assignments or forced out of government entirely. Documents related to the investigation disappeared from secure facilities. Computer files were corrupted or deleted by system malfunctions that IT experts found suspicious but couldn't prove were deliberate. Most chilling of all was the fate of the few people who tried to continue Reed's work after his attack. Maria Santos, a former Reed staffer who had copies of some corruption files, died in a house fire that investigators determined was caused by faulty wiring. David Chen, a journalist who had been investigating connections between Morrison's network and recent court decisions, was killed in a mugging gone wrong in a neighborhood where such crimes were virtually unknown. The message was clear: anyone who tried to expose the judicial corruption network would pay with their lives. The attack on Reed had been a warning to everyone in Washington about what happened to people who threatened the shadow system that really controlled American law and policy. But the most disturbing revelation from my investigation was that Morrison's network hadn't been operating independently. It had connections to foreign intelligence services that were using judicial corruption to advance their own interests in American policy. Chinese operatives had been paying for decisions that favored their trade interests. Russian agents had been influencing rulings on sanctions and energy policy. Iranian intelligence had been buying judicial protection for their money laundering operations. The corruption of the American judicial system had become a national security issue, but one that could never be publicly acknowledged without admitting that the legitimacy of the entire legal system had been compromised. The solution chosen by federal agencies was to contain the problem quietly while allowing the corruption to continue, rather than risk the political earthquake that full disclosure would have caused. Reed's silence about his attack wasn't just the result of personal threats. It was part of a broader decision by the political establishment to protect the fiction that American justice was still functioning. The alternative, admitting that federal courts had been systematically corrupted for decades, would have destroyed public faith in every institution of government. The cover-up succeeded because it served everyone's interests except those of the American people. Politicians didn't want to admit they had failed to prevent judicial corruption. Federal agencies didn't want to acknowledge their incompetence in allowing foreign intelligence services to purchase American judges. The media didn't want to report a story so complex and disturbing that it would force readers to confront the reality that American democracy was largely illusory. Harry Reid died in December 2021, taking most of his secrets with him to the grave. His family maintained the fiction that he had never fully recovered from his exercise accident, that his memory of events had never returned, but people close to Reed knew that he had chosen silence to protect his loved ones, accepting the destruction of his life's work rather than risk their safety. The judicial corruption network that Reed had tried to expose continues to operate today. Vincent Morrison died of natural causes in 2020, but his organization has been taken over by others who use the same methods to influence court decisions. The judges who were compromised during Morrison's era continue to serve on federal courts, their past corruption covered up, and their future decisions still influenced by the people who owned them. The documents that Reed had assembled about judicial corruption remain hidden, their explosive contents protected by the same forces that ordered his attack. The insurance files that could expose decades of purchased court decisions are buried in classified archives where they may remain forever. Their secrets too dangerous to the stability of American institutions to ever be revealed. As I sit here, tonight, completing this investigation that has consumed years of my life and put me in danger more times than I care to remember, I am struck by the ultimate irony of Harry Reid's story. He was a man who had spent his career working within the system, believing that American institutions could be reformed and improved through political action. His destruction came when he discovered that the system itself had been so thoroughly corrupted that reform was impossible. The attack on Reid wasn't just an assault on one senator. It was an attack on the very idea that truth and justice could still prevail in American politics. His silence in the aftermath wasn't just personal cowardice. It was an acknowledgement that the forces of corruption had become so powerful that even the most determined reformers couldn't challenge them without paying with their lives. The desert wind that was howling across Nevada on that March evening in 2018 is still blowing today, carrying with it the dust of broken dreams and murdered hopes. Harry Reid's story is a reminder that in the shadows of American power, there are forces that will kill to protect their secrets, and that justice has become just another commodity to be bought and sold by those wealthy enough to afford their own judges. If you made it this far into the darkness with us tonight, leave a comment with the word shadow, so we know you're one of the brave ones willing to confront these truths that others would prefer to keep hidden. The crimes we've explored together over these nights, from Rod Blagojevich's blatant corruption to Jim Jones's political protection, from Marion Barry's murderous drug empire to the international conspiracies that threaten our highest officials, and finally to the systematic destruction of American justice itself. They're all connected by the same thread: the willingness of those in power to commit any crime, tell any lie, and silence any witness to protect their positions and their profits. These stories aren't just history, they're prophecy. They show us what happens when we allow political power to operate without meaningful accountability. When we accept corruption as normal, when we turn away from uncomfortable truths because they're too disturbing to face. The victims of these crimes, the honest investigators, the brave witnesses, the dedicated public servants who tried to do the right thing, they died because they believed that truth and justice still mattered in America. Their deaths were not in vain if we learn from them, if we recognize the warning signs they tried to show us, if we refuse to accept the comfortable lies that allow these systems of corruption to continue operating in the shadows. The darkness is real, the corruption is pervasive, and the danger is ongoing. But knowledge is power, and truth is the only weapon we have against the forces that would turn our democracy into their personal criminal enterprise. Good night, and sweet dreams. But remember, the monsters in these stories aren't hiding under your bed or lurking in your closet. They're sitting in offices with American flags on their desks, taking oaths to protect and defend the very Constitution they're systematically destroying. Sleep well, if you can, knowing that somewhere in the shadows of power, they're still out there, still planning, still killing, still winning. The criminal nights never truly end. They just wait for the next victim, the next witness, the next person brave enough, or foolish enough to believe that truth and justice can still prevail in the land of the free and the home of the brave.